Hello, welcome to Basic English Grammar with Mary's Balls. This is Dave Colomer, and I welcome you to Module 6. Those of you who have been with us from Modules 1 through 5 are now ready to actually kind of test your knowledge of grammar by analyzing actual writings from real people. We're going to be taking a look at 6 selections of good writing. We're going to be looking at 2 poems, 1 play, and 2 speeches, and 1 definition. So we kind of look at the whole possible realm of writings, and we're going to analyze the sentences of each of those writings. By the way, in the old days, this analysis of the sentences was called parsing, P-A-R-S-I-N-G. So I'm just kind of throwing that in. I want to remind you that every word in a sentence has a function, and we're going to find those functions as we go through analyzing our sentences today. All right, our first selection is a poem called Kubla Khan. This was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the early 1800s, and you'll find this in most high school textbooks as a good example of poetry. There's more to it than this, but we're just going to look at this first part of the poem. I'm going to read through the poem first, and then we're going to go through line by line and analyze the grammar. Here we go. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a sacred pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Really a beautiful poem. But let's see how Coleridge put it together grammatically. First of all, a good way to analyze any piece of writing is to divide it into its sentences. And we kind of have a break here. So we have a sentence up here, and we have another sentence down here, separated by where. So concentrating on the first 2 lines here, what we want to do is first mark off the prepositional phrases. As we can see, Coleridge starts with a prepositional phrase, in Xanadu. Okay? Are there any more? No. Now, once we have the prepositional phrase marked off, we know that Xanadu cannot be the subject of the sentence. Because, as you recall, we have that rule saying that the subject can never be inside a prep phrase. So what else here can be the subject? Who's doing something in the sentence? Well, there's this guy named Kubla Khan who happens to be an emperor in China back in the ancient times. So he's going to be our subject, all right? Now we need a verb. What did Kubla Khan do? Well, he decreed, to decree, and we have a 2-part verb, did decree. So verb, verb. Now, what did Kubla Khan decree? Well, he decreed a dome, like a huge building, right? So that becomes our direct object. And sacred and pleasure both describe dome. So we have adjective, adjective. And there we have the first line done. Now we move on to the second line, or the second sentence actually, which is begun with where, which is a conjunction. It's joining these 2 sentences together. Let's see if we can find some other prepositional phrases. How about to a sunless sea? That's a prepositional phrase. Through caverns. That's a prep phrase, and it looks like that's about it. Well, because it's a to-man. Here we go. Now we can see that most of this sentence is made of prep phrases. Now we need a subject. Well, the subject is Alph, which is the name of the river. So that becomes our subject. The sacred river, well, river and Alph are the same thing, so we have a subject equivalent here. We're going to mark it like that. Sacred describes river, so sacred is an adjective. Okay. Now we have a verb. What did the Alph River do? It ran. All right. So that becomes our subject. All right. It ran through caverns. We already did that. Measureless. Measures looks like it's describing something. What would it be describing? How about caverns? So measureless is describing caverns. It becomes an adjective. Down tells where the river ran. So we have an adverb here. And we have just analyzed this poem. Let's move on to our next writing. Our next writing selection is from Shakespeare, and it's Macbeth. As you recall, in the very later part of the play, Lady Macbeth has gone crazy and died, and Macbeth himself mourns her death by giving this speech where he says basically that life has no purpose. But instead of Shakespeare saying life has no purpose, he gives us these beautiful words. I'm going to read the selection first, and then we'll go through and analyze the grammar. This is Macbeth talking about his wife who has passed away. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Okay, we're going to pause now, and we're going to see, first of all, there's two parts to this, and the parts are divided right here. So we're going to put a partition there so that we have the first part of the selection up here, second part of the selection down here. Now, in the first part of the selection up here, do we see any prepositional phrases? Always good to get those out of the way first. How about today, all right, to the last syllable, and of recorded time? Look at that. Holy mackerel. All right. Oh, and from day. From, almost left that out. A number of prepositional phrases. Now, once we've got those out of the way, we can look for our subject. The subject is something that's doing something in the sentence. Well, something is creeping, so what could be creeping? It must be a pace. Pace becomes our subject. It's a petty pace. It's this and petty pace, so we have two adjectives here. Okay. And the pace is creeping or creeps. So that's our verb. Notice Shakespeare puts the verb toward the end of the sentence or middle of the sentence rather than at the beginning, which is very common in artistic writing or imaginative writing. Now, what about the rest of this? Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Tomorrow is an adjective because it tells when. So we have, adverb. Adverb, adverb, adverb. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. And, of course, is a conjunction connecting tomorrow and tomorrow, tomorrow. And we have just analyzed the first part of the selection. Let's go down here. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Okay? Any prepositional phrases? Yes, to dusty death. Okay? That seems about it. So now let's look for our subject. What is actually doing something here? Well, normally yesterday, as we can see up here, normally yesterday, similar to tomorrow, would normally be an adverb, but in this case, Shakespeare is using it as a subject. Yesterdays are doing something. What are yesterdays doing? They have lighted. So we have a double verb here, have lighted. All and our refer to yesterdays, so we have two adjectives here. And, of course, is a conjunction, joining. Now, what has been lighted? Is there a direct object down here? Is it fools or is it way? This is tricky because what Shakespeare has done here is he has omitted a preposition. Yesterdays have lighted. He should have four fools the way to dusty death. So way becomes the direct object. Fools is actually an object of the preposition for, which is not there. and then we have to dusty death. So now we've completed the first part of this speech or soliloquy by Macbeth. We're going to move on to the second part. Welcome back. We now move on to the second part of Macbeth's speech about the death of his wife. And again, I'd like to read it through, and then we'll go over the grammar. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You can tell the desperation in Macbeth's voice. He is just beside himself with grief and sorrow, not over his wife, but over the meaning of life. Again, let's go through this and see how Shakespeare uses his grammar. First of all, this is one complete sentence. Let's see here. Yeah, we can divide it up here into a first part up here and a second part down here. All right. So looking at these first three lines, are there any prepositional phrases? Well, let's see. Upon the stage is a prep phrase. And that's it, surprisingly. Okay. Is there a subject here? Yes. He's using life as a subject. That becomes our subject. Is there a verb? Yes, is. Walking shadow describes life, all right? So we could either have it as a subject equivalent or we could have it as an adjective. Sometimes it takes a matter of judgment to see what we're talking about here. But he says it is, so I would call this a subject equivalent. All right, referring back to life. Life is also a poor player, another subject equivalent, referring back to life, that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. Here we have a clause, because we have a subject, that, and we have two verbs, struts and frets. A clause I'm going to mark off by brackets like this. Now, what kind of a clause is this? First of all, we're going to call it a clause with a CL. What kind of a clause? Well, it's a clause that refers back to player. So I'm going to call this an adjective clause. All right? Upon the stage, and then is heard no more. And is a conjunction, connects. Then is an adverb, tells when. Is heard no more. Okay? Refers back to life. Refers back to hour and then is heard no more. Well, it's interesting. What is heard no more? Walking shadow and poor player. So what we have here is a clause. Is heard is the verb. The subject actually is outside of the clause, referring back to life. So we have an adjective clause here. Let's go to the second part of the soliloquy. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. All right. Any prepositional phrases? Yes. By an idiot, of sound and fury, and that's all. Okay. Is there a subject here? Yes. It is the subject. Okay. Tale becomes a subject equivalent, referring back to it. Is the verb. Okay. Told by an idiot. Now we have a phrase. And I'm going to mark that off as a phrase and mark it PH as a phrase. And it's an adjective phrase because it refers back to tale. So I'm going to call it an adjective phrase. Full of sound and fury. We have another phrase, and I'm going to mark it also with brackets like this. Notice inside a phrase, sometimes we have a prep phrase, and that's what we have here. Full of sound and fury refers back to tale. We have another adjective phrase. Signifying nothing, guess what? Shakespeare uses another phrase, and because it is a phrase referring back to tale, it is an adjective phrase. And we have just analyzed Shakespeare's famous speech by Macbeth. Thank you. We are now going to move to our third writing example, and this is the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, given in 1863 after the Great Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War. We're going to only look at the first part and the last part of the speech. We can't get the whole speech on here. That'd be too much. So let me read through the first part here, and then we'll analyze the grammar. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war. All right, we'll stop there. These are the first lines of the great speech. And as we have before, we're going to divide this into sentences. So we have the first sentence up here and the second sentence starting down here. As we have done before, we're going to look for any prepositional phrases. And I see a couple already. On this continent. On as a preposition. To the proposition is a prep phrase, and I think that's all in the first sentence. Okay, unless I missed any. Nope. Okay, now we need a subject. Who's doing the action here? And there it is, fathers, subject. Okay, what are the fathers doing? They brought. There's the verb. What did they bring? Is there a direct object here? Yes, there is. They brought a nation. All right. Now remember in our first module, we talked about Mary kicked the ball, and we said that's a fundamental sentence. And we have a Mary kicked the ball right in this sentence here. I'll show you where it is. It says, fathers brought a nation. There's Mary kicked the ball again. Fathers brought a nation. The rest of this is embellishment or adornment. Okay, so let's fill in a few other things here. New, of course, talks about nation, so that's an adjective. Okay. Our also is an adjective, telling about fathers. Brought forth. Forth is an adverb because it describes brought. So, adverb. Okay. Now we have 77 years ago. What do you make of that? It's not a sentence. It doesn't really have a verb there. It's not a complete idea. So it's not even a clause. It is a phrase. And we're going to mark it as a phrase in brackets like this. And because it tells when this all happened, we're going to call it an adverb phrase. Okay. And what else is here? Brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. All right. Again, is that a phrase or is that a clause? Well, conceived is a verb, but there's no subject here. Oh, in fact, in liberty is a prep phrase I forgot. Okay, so conceived in liberty becomes a phrase. And what kind of phrase is it? It's an adjective phrase referring back to nation. Adjective phrase. And, we have a conjunction here. There's more. Dedicated. Okay. Dedicated to the proposition. So we have another phrase. Dedicated to the proposition. This is also an adjective phrase. All right. Referring back to nation. That all men are created equal. Is this a phrase or a clause? Well, as you recall, if it has a subject and a verb, it's a clause. And this is men are created. This is the clause. We're going to mark it off as a clause. And it's a clause that refers back to proposition. So it's an adverb clause. Let's go to the second sentence in this part of the selection here. Now we are engaged in a great civil war. This is very straightforward. Prepositional phrase, in a great civil war. All right. Subject, we. Verb, are engaged. Now is an adverb telling when. And there we go. We have just completed this part of Lincoln's speech. We're now back for the second part of the Gettysburg Address by President Lincoln. And as before, I'm going to read it through, and then we'll get back and examine the grammar that Mr. Lincoln used. We highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And as we can start now, as we have before, what is the first thing we try to do is break it up into parts so that we can work with it. And it's a little bit hard to break this up. It's like one continuous statement. So we're not going to do that this time. I think what we're going to start with, as we have done before, is to look for prepositional phrases. And let's see if we can find some. Let's see. Well, we have in vain, so there's a nice phrase. Under God, I see as another prepositional phrase. Of freedom. Oh, they're popping up everywhere here. Okay. Government of the people. Of is a preposition. By the people. By is a preposition. And for the people. For is a preposition. Shall not perish from the earth. So Mr. Lincoln has given us quite a few prepositional phrases in his speech here. Now, as we've done before, let's look for the subject. Is there a subject here? Very likely it is the pronoun we. So we're going to mark that with a S for subject. Now we need a verb. What are we doing here? Well, we are resolving. To resolve is to be determined or to make sure. So we're going to give that the capital V. Highly tells about resolve, so we know that highly is an adverb. Adverb. Now we have a group of words that begins with the relative pronoun that. And whenever we do, we want to look for a clause. And a clause, of course, will have a subject and a verb. So do we have a subject? Yes. The dead, these dead. Do we have a verb? Yes. Shall not have died. So this definitely is a clause. All right. Now we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a clause is this? Is it a noun clause, an adjective clause, or an adverb clause? And I would say that taking our cue from the verb resolve here, that it's actually acting as a direct object. So it is a noun clause. Noun clause. And the function is acting as direct object, getting back to resolve. Now, that these dead shall not have died in vain. Now, look at this. We run into another group of words beginning with that this nation shall have a new birth. So we have a subject, nation, shall have a verb. So guess what? We have another clause here. This nation shall have a new birth. Yeah, and we're going to end it right there. And again, this is another noun clause because guess what? It is acting as a direct object, getting back to resolve. So we have two direct objects so far. Let's see where this takes us now. And, well, we have a conjunction, so and is joining everything that has come before with everything that we're heading into. That government, there's another that. Mr. Lincoln is nothing if not consistent here. Government is the subject, shall not perish is the verb, and so we have another clause. Shall not perish, and we're going to mark that clause with brackets as we've done before. And again, it looks like a noun clause because it goes back to we resolve that government and so on. So we're going to denote this as a noun clause, and we're going to denote it as acting or functioning as the direct object. Just to be sure that these are clauses, let's go back and double check and make sure that each clause has a subject and a verb. This clause here, the subject is dead, and the verb is shall have died. Not is an adverb. Okay. Let's look at the next clause, which starts here. This nation is the subject of the clause. Shall have is the verb of the clause. And actually we have a little direct object inside there also. So that qualifies as a clause. And finally, we have that government shall not perish. Government is acting as a subject, and shall not perish is a two-word verb. Not is an adverb. And it shall not perish from the earth. And there we have this beautiful speech by Mr. Lincoln, and that kind of wraps this up. Thank you very much.